Households in England face £3,000 council tax bills, a growing financial crisis. Millions of households in England are facing an alarming financial burden as council tax bills are predicted to soar to unprecedented levels, potentially reaching £3,000 annually. This dramatic increase is set to exacerbate the cost of living crisis, leaving many families struggling to make ends meet as inflation, rising energy costs, and stagnant wages continue to tighten their budgets. Local authorities across the country are grappling with mounting financial pressures. Many councils have reported significant shortfalls in funding from central government, forcing them to raise council tax to sustain essential public services. These include waste collection, education, social care, and emergency services, all of which have seen heightened demand in recent years. The COVID-19 pandemic further strained local budgets, with councils forced to allocate additional resources to health and welfare services. The scale of the crisis: in some areas, council tax increases are projected to climb by more than 5% in the coming year, with regions heavily reliant on local funding facing even steeper hikes. The average Band D council tax bill, which was £1,966 in 2023, is expected to surpass £2,000 in many parts of the country and could approach the £3,000 mark in higher tax regions. This would represent one of the largest year-on-year increases in recent history. For middle and lower-income households, this rise is particularly devastating. Many families already allocate a significant portion of their income to housing costs, utility bills, and food, leaving little room to absorb additional expenses. Recent surveys indicate that over 60% of households are concerned about their ability to meet council tax payments in the coming year, with some expressing fears of falling into arrears or facing legal action for non-payment. Criticism of the government's role: critics have pointed fingers at central government policies, accusing ministers of shifting the financial burden onto local authorities while failing to provide adequate funding. Many argue that this approach disproportionately impacts working-class families and vulnerable communities, who are less equipped to cope with rising costs. Caroline Adams, a single mother from Manchester, shared her concerns: "I already struggle to pay my bills each month, and now I'm being told to find even more money for council tax. It feels like we're being punished for something that's out of our control." Opposition parties have also weighed in on the issue, calling for urgent reform to the council tax system. Labour MP Jonathan Reynolds said, "The current model is outdated and deeply unfair. It places too much of the burden on households rather than addressing the systemic funding issues facing our councils. The government must step in to ensure that families are not pushed to the brink." Calls for reform: experts have long argued for a complete overhaul of the council tax system, which they say is regressive and fails to account for modern economic realities. The current system, introduced in 1993, bases tax bands on property valuations from that time, creating significant inequalities between households in different regions. For instance, residents in London often pay lower council tax rates than those in northern towns. Despite higher property values in the capital, proposals for reform have included re-evaluating property bands to reflect current market values, introducing means-tested council tax rates, or replacing the system altogether with a more progressive income-based levy. However, successive governments have been reluctant to tackle the politically sensitive issue, fearing backlash from voters and property owners. The human impact: the rising council tax bills are expected to have far-reaching consequences for families and communities across England. For many, it will mean making tough choices, such as cutting back on essentials or delaying payments on other debts. Charities and community organizations warn that the increases could lead to a rise in poverty, food insecurity, and homelessness if struggling families are unable to keep up with their bills. Local charity worker Sarah Jenkins said, "We're already seeing more people coming to food banks and requesting help with their bills. These council tax hikes will only add to the pressure on families and the services they rely on. It's a vicious cycle." What comes next? The government has pledged to monitor the situation, but critics argue that monitoring alone is insufficient. Without meaningful intervention, millions of households will continue to bear the brunt of rising costs, pushing them further into financial hardship. In the face of growing public discontent, there is mounting pressure on policymakers to act. Whether through short-term relief measures, such as capping council tax increases, or long-term structural reform, the question remains: will the government step up to provide the support that households desperately need? For now, families across England face an uncertain and challenging road ahead, as the cost of living crisis shows no signs of easing. The soaring council tax bills are just one symptom of a larger issue, a system in need of reform and a nation calling out for relief.